The mist hung heavy over the small coastal town of Millbrook that November morning, the kind of fog that seems to swallow sound and time itself. It was exactly 3:47 a.m. when she walked through the front door of the Seaside Inn, her footsteps barely audible on the worn wooden floors. Martha Webb, the night clerk, barely looked up from her crossword puzzle as the woman approached the front desk. She was unremarkable in that deliberate way some people cultivate, like she'd practiced being forgettable. Medium height, brown hair tucked beneath a plain wool hat, dark coat that had seen better years. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost apologetic. She needed a room for the night, she said. Just one night. Cash only. Martha slid the registration book across the counter, the pages yellowed from years of salt air and countless signatures. The woman picked up the pen, hesitated for just a moment, then wrote something Martha couldn't quite make out in the dim light. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, like someone concentrating very hard on forming each letter correctly. Room 7 was available, Martha said, fishing the key from its hook behind the desk. Up the stairs. Second door on the right. The woman nodded, took the key, and disappeared into the shadows of the stairwell. Martha heard her footsteps fade down the hallway above, heard the soft click of a door closing, then nothing but the familiar sounds of the old inn settling into the night. The fog was still thick at dawn when Martha's replacement, young Tommy Hartwell, arrived for the morning shift. He'd grown up in Millbrook, knew the rhythms of the inn like his own heartbeat. The first thing he always did was check the guest register, see who'd come and gone in the night. That's when he noticed something odd. Room 7 was marked as occupied, but when he looked at the registration book, the signature was just a smear of ink, like someone had deliberately dragged their hand across wet writing. He climbed the stairs, knocked gently on the door. No answer. He tried again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. Using his master key, Tommy pushed open the door to room 7. The bed was made, corners tucked with military precision. The small writing desk by the window was clear except for a single glass of water, untouched. The bathroom was spotless, towels hanging exactly as housekeeping had left them. It was as if no one had ever been there at all, but someone had been there. The window was open, just a crack, letting in the morning air, and on the windowsill, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a single thread of brown wool, caught on the old wood, the same brown as the woman's coat. Tommy called down to Martha, who was just finishing her shift. She climbed the stairs, looked around the room with growing confusion. The woman had definitely been here, she insisted. She remembered her clearly now in the daylight, sort of clearly. Actually, the more Martha tried to recall specific details, the more they seemed to slip away, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. What did she look like exactly? Medium height, Martha said, then paused. Or maybe she was shorter, brown hair, definitely brown hair. Or was it black? She wore a coat, a dark coat. The memories felt real but somehow insubstantial, like trying to remember a dream after waking. They called the police, more out of procedure than real concern. Officer Janet Morrison arrived within the hour, notebook in hand, ready to take statements. But what statements were there to take? A woman had checked in, paid for her room in cash, and apparently left without checking out. The only unusual thing was that she'd left no trace of her presence, and now even the memories of her seemed to be fading. Janet examined the registration book, squinting at the smeared signature. She'd seen plenty of false names in her time, people trying to hide from ex-spouses or creditors or worse. But this wasn't even an attempt at deception. It was more like someone had tried to erase themselves from the record even as they were creating it. The thread on the windowsill was bagged as evidence, though evidence of what, nobody could say. Janet took photographs of the room, dusted for fingerprints on surfaces the woman might have touched. The doorknob, the window latch, the water glass. Nothing. Not even a partial print. As if the woman had worn gloves the entire time, or as if she'd never really touched anything at all. Word spread through Millbrook the way news does in small towns, carried on coffee shop conversations and grocery store encounters. The story grew with each telling, details shifting and changing like sand in the tide. Some said the woman was young, others insisted she was middle-aged. Some remembered her carrying a suitcase, others swore she had nothing but the clothes on her back. Mrs. Henderson from the bakery was certain she'd seen the woman walking past her shop around midnight, but when pressed for details, she couldn't say which direction she'd been walking or even what night it had been. The memory felt real, but somehow untethered from time and place. Tom Brady, who ran the gas station on the edge of town, thought maybe he'd sold cigarettes to someone matching her description. But then again, maybe it had been last week or last month. The security camera footage from that night showed nothing unusual, just the empty street and the occasional car passing through the pool of lamplight. The Seaside Inn had been keeping guest registers for over 60 years, thick leather-bound books filled with the names and addresses of travelers passing through. Janet spent an afternoon going through them, looking for any pattern, any previous occurrence of a guest, vanishing without a trace. She found plenty of people who'd skipped out on their bills, left without checking out, even a few who'd caused enough trouble to be escorted off the property by police. But nothing like this. There was something different about this disappearance, something that made it stick in people's minds even as the details refused to come into focus. It wasn't just that she'd left without a trace. It was as if she'd been designed to leave no trace, as if her very presence had been temporary, provisional, like a pencil sketch that could be erased at will. Dr. Elizabeth Cray, who'd been the town's physician for 30 years, had seen her share of unusual cases. When Janet mentioned the strange quality of people's memories about the woman, how they seemed certain but vague at the same time, Dr. Cray nodded thoughtfully. She'd heard of similar phenomena before, usually associated with trauma or extreme stress. Sometimes the mind protected itself by making memories hard to access, even when they weren't particularly painful. But this was different. This was multiple people all experiencing the same kind of memory distortion about the same event. It was as if the woman had somehow projected an aura of forgetfulness, making herself difficult to remember even as people were actively trying to recall her. The investigation, if it could be called that, continued for weeks. Janet interviewed everyone who might have encountered the woman that night, but the trail grew colder with each passing day, not because new evidence wasn't turning up, but because the existing evidence seemed to be fading. People who'd been certain about details a few days earlier now found themselves uncertain, questioning their own memories. The only constant was the room itself. Room 7 at the Seaside Inn, forever changed by one night's occupancy that might never have happened at all. Martha refused to rent it out for a while, claiming it felt different somehow, though she couldn't explain what she meant. The air seemed thicker there, she said, like it was holding its breath. Tommy noticed it too. When he cleaned the room, which he did obsessively now, he sometimes felt like he wasn't alone, not in a frightening way, but as if someone was watching him work, approving of his thoroughness. The feeling was strongest near the window, where that single brown thread had been found. Winter settled over Millbrook, bringing with it the usual rhythms of a coastal town in the off-season. The seaside inn saw fewer guests, mostly traveling salesmen and the occasional family visiting relatives. Room 7 remained empty, not because it was officially closed, but because somehow no one ever seemed to ask for it specifically, and Martha and Tommy never seemed to think to offer it. The brown thread disappeared from the evidence locker sometime in January. Officer Morrison noticed it was missing during a routine inventory, but the paperwork trail led nowhere. No one had signed it out, no one remembered moving it, no one could explain how a piece of physical evidence could simply vanish from a locked room in a small-town police station. By spring, the story had become part of Millbrook's local folklore, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. The details had crystallized into a standard version. A mysterious woman in a brown coat had checked into the seaside inn one foggy November night and vanished by morning, leaving no trace except questions that no one could answer. But even as the story became fixed, the actual memories continued to fade. Martha found herself uncertain whether she'd really worked that night or just heard about it from someone else. The morning after the incident, Millbrook felt different. The fog seemed thicker, clinging to windows like fingers reluctant to let go. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the post office and knew everyone's business, found herself unable to recall exactly what the woman had looked like. She'd spoken to her just that evening, but the memory felt like trying to hold water in cupped hands. It was Detective Morrison who first noticed the peculiarities weren't isolated to the inn. He arrived from the county seat 3 days later, a methodical man with tired eyes who'd seen enough mysteries to know when something didn't add up. What he found was a town wrestling with collective amnesia. The grocer swore he'd sold cigarettes to a woman in a brown coat, but couldn't remember her face. The librarian insisted someone had asked about bus schedules to Portland, but the details slipped away like smoke. Each witness seemed to grasp fragments of truth that dissolved under scrutiny. Morrison spent hours at the seaside inn, examining the room where she'd supposedly stayed. The window remained open, as Thomas had found it, though no one could explain why it wouldn't close properly now. The frame seemed warped, as if the wood itself had been changed by her presence. That single brown thread had vanished completely, despite Morrison's explicit instructions that nothing be disturbed. What troubled him most was the guest register. The smeared signature had become even more illegible, the ink seeming to fade with each passing day. By the end of the week, only a faint stain remained on the page, like the ghost of writing that had never quite existed. The investigation expanded beyond Millbrook when Morrison discovered similar incidents in neighboring towns. A woman matching the vague description had been reported in Westford, checking into the Harborview Motel under a name no one could recall. She'd disappeared there, too, leaving behind only questions and that same peculiar amnesia among the staff. In Thorndale, 60 miles south, a boarding house owner reported a similar occurrence from the previous autumn. A woman in dark clothing, quiet and polite, who'd vanished without trace. The owner, Mrs. Prescott, had called it in at the time, but the local police had dismissed it as a simple case of someone leaving without paying. Now, hearing Morrison's questions, she realized how much she'd forgotten about that night. The pattern became clear as Morrison connected the dots across a map of coastal Maine. Over the past 2 years, at least 7 establishments had reported similar disappearances. Always a woman traveling alone. Always the same mysterious departure. Always followed by that strange fog of forgetfulness that seemed to settle over witnesses like a spell. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist from the university, became interested in the case when Morrison reached out to academic contacts. She'd studied collective memory phenomena and suggested that the amnesia might be psychosomatic, triggered by some shared trauma or suggestion. But even she couldn't explain why physical evidence seemed to vanish alongside the memories. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Eleanor Marsh, a retired teacher in her 80s, contacted Morrison after reading about the case in the regional newspaper. She'd been keeping a detailed diary for over 60 years, recording the mundane events of small-town life with the precision of a historian. Her entry from November 15th was brief, but crucial. Strange woman at the inn today. Something not right about her. The next entry, dated November 16th, made no mention of the woman at all, but there was an unusual gap in Eleanor's handwriting, as if she'd started to write something and then stopped. The hollow ones were part of local folklore that most residents had forgotten or dismissed as superstition. According to Eleanor's research into old town records, they were described as travelers who appeared human but cast no lasting impression on memory or physical reality. They were said to be searching for something, moving from place to place in an endless quest that no one understood. Morrison found himself caught between rational investigation and something that defied logical explanation. The evidence suggested a very real person had stayed at the inn and then left. But the consistent pattern of fading memories and vanishing evidence pointed to something beyond normal experience. The case took its strangest turn when Morrison himself began to forget details. His meticulous notes became harder to read, as if the ink was fading. The photographs he'd taken at the inn showed increasingly less detail with each viewing. Even his own memories of the investigation seemed to blur around the edges. Dr. Chen documented the phenomenon, noting that proximity to the case seemed to accelerate the memory degradation. She theorized that some unknown factor was actively working to erase traces of the woman's existence, like an immune system response from reality itself. Thomas never fully recovered from that night. He continued working at the inn, but avoided room 7 whenever possible. On quiet evenings, he claimed he could still feel her presence in the building, a weight in the air that pressed against his consciousness. He began leaving the inn earlier each day, unable to shake the feeling that she might return. The room itself became a source of fascination for the few who knew the story. Guests reported strange dreams when staying there, always featuring a woman they couldn't quite see clearly. Some woke with the sensation that someone had been standing by their bed, watching them sleep. The management eventually stopped renting the room, claiming it needed repairs that somehow never got completed. As winter deepened, the investigation ground to a halt. Morrison's files contained almost nothing concrete, just fragments of testimony that grew more contradictory with each review. The case officially remained open, but there was nothing left to investigate. The woman who had vanished at dawn had taken the mystery with her, leaving behind only questions that couldn't be answered and memories that refused to hold their shape. The story became part of Millbrook's unofficial history, told in whispers at the diner and shared among locals who still remembered fragments of that strange November night. But even those memories continued to fade, like footprints in sand being slowly erased by the tide. Some say she's still out there, moving from town to town along the coast, checking into small inns and leaving before sunrise. A traveler caught between worlds, searching for something that might not exist, pursued by a mystery that consumes itself even as it unfolds. The woman who vanished at dawn, forever disappearing into the space between memory and forgetting, between presence and absence, between the world we know and the shadows that exist just beyond our understanding.